Um, so yeah, let's get some thoughts. What have you experienced when there is a lower level of maturity in um, in the facilitator's approach than in the team or the group that they're facilitating? Let's talk about a little bit of fallback. And to those of you that have not yet encountered much of maturity, just a note around this. If you're very keen, today is maybe a swim in the deep end kind of day because it's supervision. But if you are interested in learning more about the details of the methodology, we have a level 2 course coming up at the beginning of April that you may want to sign up for. I'll put dates up for us later. So let's get a couple of thoughts. What happens when the facilitator is the person that's pulling the conversation into an earlier stage of maturity? Has anyone experienced that? And what happens?
I'm happy to start things off, Lucille.
Great,
so
thanks, Duncan.
In my experience, the container for vulnerability and trust starts to lose its rigidity. It starts to dissolve. And what happens is it limits the group from being able to do the deeper part of the work, especially if there's some conflict present.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any examples in mind that could like help other people feel into that? Just like something you've experienced that you may want to share the experience, the details of the experience as an example?
I was part of a group where the facilitators were not able to hold the container for the room to the point where the group, couldn't really move forward with the work that needed to be done. And, I think of it as like a technical or adaptive leadership challenge where what was emerging wasn't able to be kept in the container. And so what ended up happening was it was almost like the group was trying to reassemble or put out the fire rather than allow it to burn and be with it and be an inquiry and get curious about it as a way to move through what was blocking the team from moving forward.
Yeah. And what a missed opportunity. What a missed opportunity in that moment. Yeah, thanks. Let's hear one or two other examples. What happens for you? What happens to the process?
I shared in my group, Lucille, that I've been in programs where I didn't feel the competence was there and with the facilitator, not only in the way they facilitated, but also in what needed to be delivered. So on a competence level. And for me, it triggers me tremendously. So my ego is really going through the roof and I get disrespectful. I go through that same level of low maturity at the same time and start being righteous and frustrated and my face can't hold it all together. So I go to an awful place. I don't like myself at all when that happens. So
yeah, thanks for sharing that, Pat. I do confess to being triggered in processes and misbehaving in groups. I've definitely done the same thing, so I can relate. I can relate to that. Thanks. Yeah, and I guess let's hear one more example. Anyone else with anything you've noticed when the facilitator is kind of the one that's pulling the maturity of the group to an earlier stage? Steph.
Thank you. So yeah, I shared in the group that for me, it gives me a visceral kind of experience of stress, like I'm being forced somewhere that I'm not ready to go. And and for me, it creates a complete disconnect from what was going on, for example, in the small group discussion, and suddenly we're being wrenched somewhere else. So I become very resistant and more passive aggressive, which is not a trait that I normally see in myself, but that level of dis-ease is so strong that I really, pull back.
Great. So, Nicola,
I know you said one more person, but sorry. I had the experience I was saying in more one-on-one conversations where it's felt like we've been able to make progress if the coaches felt like at a lower level, but it's like one line. It just feels like progress along one simple thing, because I've felt myself having to leave the mess out, leave the complexity out. So it doesn't have to be a fully negative experience, but just it feels thin.
Yeah. I like that description. I think that's useful for us to work with. That idea of, it doesn't mean that we're not making progress, but there's something either, as in Duncan's example, that goes missing in terms of the depth, or maybe the progress that we're making feels thinner. It feels more limited. It feels as though some of the complexity is being ignored in some kind of way or not fully coming in. So the solution might also be limited to some extent. So let's go to the other opposite of the spectrum. And here we may have different experiences. Once again, what happens if the facilitator of the group session is coming into a group at a later stage of maturity? And I don't know if it came up in any of the groups, any differentiation between just a little bit more mature than the group versus a lot more mature than the group potentially. So any thoughts around that and what you've experienced and what you've seen? And maybe we're not always talking about all of the strands of maturity, all the different emotional, cognitive, moral, physical, all of the strands coming together, but some of them. So what have you experienced, and what can you share around that other experience? And if your groups didn't get to speak about that, but you've thought about it, feel free to bring it in.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in here. I think if a facilitator is coming in at a higher stage of, or a later stage of maturity, and there's quite a gap between me and that facilitator, then I can have an experience of feeling quite lost, quite confused, like I've lost my anchor, and quite a lot of frustration in the process of just needing like some anchoring. And I think especially if that has come in without a starting of meeting me or the group where they are, it's quite discombobulating and throwing. And I've seen other people like in a group process like that feel quite like thrown out, quite excluded, quite isolated, quite lost. If somebody has met the group, I think, where they are, and then once safety and trust has been built, and then leans in and stretches us, I find that opens up the conversation. There's still some discomfort, but it's discomfort that the group is able to sit with and navigate through, that leads to a grapple and learning. But I think it does depend on at what, like how much later does the facilitator come in, and have they met us before bringing in the later stage.
Beautiful. Thanks for bringing that kind of temporal perspective, into play there. I have personally misbehaved as badly with facilitators coming in at very late stages who haven't met me and or the group where it's at, as I have with people coming in at earlier stages. So I will confess to being problematic in groups both ways, and possibly even in the middle. I don't know, maybe it's a lot of my reactive energy that comes in here.
Me too, Lucille. I don't have much differentiation in either way, because I would also be frustrated, and I also have been frustrated with facilitators who come in and don't meet the group where they are. I think that's also incompetent.
Mm-hmm.
And that annoys the hell out of me, especially when I paid a lot of money for the program.
Beautiful. Thanks, Pat. Anyone else that wants to talk about what you've seen happen in groups where the facilitator is further along, whether they're meeting the group or not? I mean, I can remember, Christy, we've had 1 or 2 symposiums talking about the work of Heidegger and some other things where I have felt left with a complete headache, having extended myself, tried so hard to stay with where the conversation is at, and having felt miserably that sometimes it's interesting. I think I feel a bit stupid. And I'm not sure that that at all has, for example, been the intention of the person bringing the conversation. So here, there's another part of disclosure maybe for me.
I've also felt stupid in conversation. I actually often feel stupid in conversations if I can't understand what's going on. Mm. Mm. There's a sort of a mixed bag of, because you say not all the strands of maturity, is a bit of a mixed bag of maturity, because it's maybe intellectually very advanced and actually quite blind on some other levels. I also sometimes feel in conversations like that, there's this funny thing that happens of a sort of a clickiness that forms around I don't know, the guru. I've seen this so often in the years that I try to walk religious paths. It's the guru, and then the guru would have the guru's groupie, and they would speak a language that is, well, it's like, whoa, I must get in on that language, but no. Deep down, you also feel like, it's nonsense, this.
Wonderful. That's a very interesting perspective, to just notice what it does to group formation and what it does to the fault lines in a group when there are some that can keep up or some that can't in some kind of way.
Yeah. I've seen that happen in an organization. I mean, organization where we both were, where a huge divide come into existence between one group in the organization and the rest of the organization. And it almost literally splits the organization in two. It's a small organization. But I can imagine that can happen and that was unfacilitated. That was just group process.
Yeah. Useful. So useful to think about these things. So what I'd like us to think about together today is, firstly, we'll work with something we work with on the level 3 teams accreditation, this idea of the requisite level of maturity. And then we'll look at how do we help groups mature without doing these things where we try and push the group too far, or we become incomprehensible to groups, or or we hold the groups back. So how do we work with that? So in the chat box, I'd love you to do a little bit of guesswork. If you had to guess what the most, and for those of you that are less afraid with the maturity framework, maybe let me put something on the screen that can just show the stages of maturity. I'm just going to, sorry, I'll pop it on the screen, but don't read the words on the left. Just look at the framework. Sorry, I should have done my slides differently, I realized. So just look at the fan here. So the different stages: self-protecting, conforming, specializing, performing, internalizing, strategizing. We'll talk about them very briefly as action logics. But if you were to guess, those of you that are familiar with the maturity framework, where most groups, most teams in corporate, and this might be public sector, private sector, not-for-profit, if you think of it, if you had to place bets, where do you think you would meet most teams from a maturity perspective? Let's just see what's happening there in the chat. So just make your guesses. And if you have a reason why you say that, you can, but otherwise just pop a guess in there. So, okay, we have consensus very quickly. Specializing, 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 and then some specializing into performing. Okay, so that is indeed what you find most often in groups. Yeah, you find some, so I have worked with groups at conforming, teams at conforming. I've worked with teams at specializing. I've worked with teams at performing, and I've had the privilege of working with 1 or 2 teams at internalizing, but they have been few and far between. So your most likely space to find people, if you think about putting 10 people together and how the conventional stages of maturity are split, is you will most often work with groups at specializing. And specializing going into performing, if you have more mature teams that are doing their internal work, you may find the team already sits at performing stage. But that's kind of where you most often find groups. And so I think it's part of our job to decode what that means. And right up front, given how quickly we got to consensus on this, I'm going to put a warning thing out there. Do not assume that all groups are at specializing and design for everything to be at specializing. I think that could be very dangerous, yeah, in some kind of way, because what happens if you're the facilitator that has designed it specializing, and you're not paying attention and the group is actually further along? Then you're doing that thing that we looked at in the check-in. Welcome, Miriam. We're in the conversation, so we'll just keep going. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if we had to just very briefly, if I had to do a quick teams version of the different stages of maturity, for those of you that are newer to it, I don't want to get stuck there. But now we're thinking about a collective being here, not an individual, right? So a team that is itself protecting, is it really a team? That is a very good question. Because here people are in short-term gain, everything for me, everything for myself. Maybe you do get some, I don't know, maybe they're called gangs. I don't know. Maybe they're just groups where things are quite fragmented because each one's going for himself. Maybe you call this parliament. I don't know. There's lots of ideas we can have here. But self-protecting, you don't really call it a team. It's not a team. It might be something else, but it's not a team. And here, very short term, what do I want? How do I get the cookies now? And everyone's doing that at the same time. If we go to, and so the need for discipline and for very strong performance management and very strict rules and enforcing rules is part of what you get there. Maybe you call it a high school classroom. Yeah. So think of what high school teachers have to do to get those groups of teenagers to work together. A group that is at conforming here is a group that often has very strong sense of belonging, very big ideas around leaders needing to be mommies and daddies that take care of us, a very strong need for standard procedure, standard operating procedure. This is how we do things. We don't make things too complex. We want our leaders to know and our leaders to be kind but firm. We don't necessarily want our leaders to be particularly participative, that's in a way that's challenging. We want to be protected from change. We might be quite threatened by what's happening in other stakeholder groups around us. And when we come together, we may be very nice. play nicely together, and we may struggle to bring in new people that are very different to us into the group. But there's often strong coherence in a group like this, but it can also become a place where where if there's not enough structure and standard operating procedures keeping us safe, the group becomes unsafe and then turns on the leader and makes the leader wrong for not providing safety and structure. Specializing teams are teams that really value expertise, that really value having strong frameworks, that are very much focused on the ideas of meritocracy. You know, it's not about who you are, it's about your competence. And here the expectation of the leader is often to be someone that knows. The leader needs to be someone who knows more about what we're doing than we do. And the leader needs to leave us to do our work, and yet needs to understand the work better than we do. So this is not a team that has lots of time for things like culture. We prefer to talk about strategy. We want to know what our key performance areas are, and we need to know what metrics we go for. And we can work quite well towards that, but we're not that interested in doing check-ins. We're not that interested in talking about culture unless it's in a technical way. So many teams that want to talk about human things inside the specializing phase survey it all. We're not going to talk about how the group's doing. We're going to pulse it. We're going to survey it. We're not going to find a way of having dialogue together. We're going to send out a survey. So there's a lot of that kind of mentality that happens here. And generally, we love building spreadsheets. We're very solution oriented, but we try and maybe fit more things into our spreadsheets or into our processes than actually belong there. Which then takes us into the space where we have performing teams. Performing teams are teams that are starting to figure out that it's not just about what we do, which is very much the focus in the specializing and even the conforming stages. It's really focusing on how we do things as well. And in the performing phase, things like conversations that talk about productive conflict start emerging, where it's specializing, we're more in, we have differences of opinion and we agree to disagree. In the performing phase, we're a lot more in the space where we focused on outcomes, not so much how we get there, but what we get in the end. So it's not have we followed the dots in the right sequence. It's how do we get to the results that we want? And what's the most effective way to get to the results? And how can we be engaged in that process? So culture and strategy are starting to come together a little bit in the performing phase. People have a lot more time to talk about feelings, and there's the space that, okay, there's a point where we have to get to work now, okay? It's now become inefficient, and can we please get back to what the real job is? That's maybe underlying to that. The performing phase, people have agency. So there we want our leader to involve us, and we may revolt a little bit if the leader becomes too autocratic. We want to be consulted at the very least. We use language like buy-in. Want to be consulted so I can buy into the change. It's not necessarily yet the language of co-creation or emergence, but there's a lot more time and space for qualitative, process-based thinking and work. And then if we get to the internalizing phase, these are teams that want to generally self-manage, teams that want to be very participative. Here, I don't want to be consulted for buy-in, I want to co-create. And where sometimes we become maybe a little bit inefficient because we're trying to have all the voices be heard. And at the same time, we may get a little bit off our core mandate at times because we get sidetracked into some other important conversations and themes. But if you zoom out into the long arc, an effective team at internalizing gets things done, but in a lot, often a more collaborative and are more comfortable with emergence, more comfortable with discomfort, more comfortable with not everyone having to agree, and then talking about how we work through our disagreements, not just getting to the outcome, but really trying to find each other in that space. We need lots of teams at strategizing, which brings that awareness of how we collaborate together with remembering our core mandate and really figuring out how to work with the system in a longitudinal way. And some teams do bounce into that. Remember, it's all a center of gravity at a point in time. We bounce into that, but it's hard to stay there as a collective. It takes a really, really strong design team alliance and a strong commitment to staying in that space for a long time, because it's hard work. It's hard work to stay with that level of complexity over time. So I don't know, I'm just going to pause there and say any questions. I'm not going to do teams at transforming. I've never experienced one. I've experienced individuals at transforming, but I haven't experienced teams there. So it's hard. It's hard. The bigger the collective, the lower the common denominators are in general, in my experience. So questions, comments? Pat.
I have a question, because I know you do team assessments based upon individual assessments, and I've worked with them a couple of times and they're really spot on. But I'm also wondering if a team, doesn't go for the individual assessments, and we want to observe a team. Let's say we step into a meeting and say, let me observe and get a sense. Is that something that is it something we can learn to quickly assess or get a sense by just observing them in a team meeting of 1 hour or 90 minutes? Yeah,
I think there's a lot of value in the observational piece. And there's actually some people in the broader adult development, the ADT community, that talk about the different ways in which we can assess maturity. So the one would be to say, look at the individual's levels of maturity, and then you aggregate that in some way, which is what we do in our team report. The other way, which it's very interesting to think about how you measure it, but it is to look at the interaction between the nodes. That would be the complexity-based language for this, but to look at the interactions between the members in the team, and to see what maturity is playing out there. Now, because the interactions between the members of teams are also regulated by form, sometimes you can get a really good assessment from an hour of observation, and sometimes a really less accurate observation from a 1 hour. So if I can explain that, if I'm working with an agile team and I'm observing them in their daily stand-up, there's a certain form to the stand-up that constricts how the team engages with each other. Yeah. And it's a positive constraint that it places on the team. But I might see something very different if I just observe them in a 3-hour strategy conversation.
Oh, yeah, I get that.
So you have to think about where you're observing them and when you're observing them. But observing teams is really, really useful. And yeah, maybe there's a couple of people with thoughts around that. So when I observe teams and I'm thinking about maturity, what are some of the things I'm looking for? So I'm looking at the interactions between the nodes. I think the first thing that I'm looking for is I'm just looking at whether the conversation is input focused or output focused as a starting point. Are we all describing what we're doing, or are we having conversations about why we're doing it and what the outcomes are that we're looking for? So that's one of the key things. Where is most of the information? So a lot of conforming, specializing conversations can be very input focused. Sometimes specializing conversations can be very, what are the steps in the process along the way focused. Whereas at the performing stage, we're starting to talk more about to what end, what are we hoping to achieve? And it's also to look at who gets listened to, who gets affirmed, and who gets shut down. So if I remember a particular executive team at a production facility, a rural tire manufacturing, like this is it's a very interesting sector to work in. And they're looking at the plant executive team, the management team of the plant. And it's interesting because most of them were at conforming stages. And then there was this one member in the team who was actually at a strategizing stage. And what kept happening in the group when you observe them having conversations is this person trying to bring a more long-term perspective, trying to get out of just talking about what machine has broken down again and how we're going to fix it, into why is that machine breaking down all the time. And he would get shut down and dismissed. So you can see, on both sides, where's the band of gravity that gets listened to? Or what kinds of contributions there's energy around it, and what kinds of contributions just kind of fall flat. And so I'm looking at that when I'm looking at a team. I think in this day and age, it's a little bit tricky to just listen for emotional language, because so much or conversations around the right words being used, because there's a lot of aboutism in teams. So we might have teams talking about, yes, we need to create a culture where everyone can be themselves. But then you observe the team not being themselves in the team all the time, but the right words are being said. So also to say, no, we really value emotions, but when people bring in emotions, we shut them down. Or we've been trained in a good EQ model, or we've been trained in the Enneagram. And so we're bringing in certain things, but we're not really elevating the conversation through it. So it's always to also not just listen at the surface level, but to also look at whether the themes that are being discussed are being felt through how the team operates. It's that thing of like the leader saying, I really believe in a participative leadership style. And then when we have executive team meetings, I shut everyone down when they challenge or bring a different perspective to mine. It's that thing, it's not just about the words, but you can feel it. And you can also listen for timescales. Is it all about this week? Okay, are we able to collectively think about this month, this quarter, this year? And then particularly lean into how the conflict or the challenge moments play out. Do we quickly go back to making it nice? Do we argue and debate? Do we allow for something to emerge from it? What's the level of comfort with it? So those would be some of the things I look for. Maybe we can hear from one or two other people. What do you listen for when you're trying to hear maturity in a system, in a team? Miriam.
I listen to how they're interacting. I observe the energy in the room and whether they're moving forward or sitting back, and who they're looking at, and their responses. Are they actually responding to what's being said, or they're responding to something in their head? So how they're stepping out.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Anything else you wanted to say?
I was going to say I'm doing some work with a team at a food bank here where I am, and I just started, and they're being so polite with one another. It's almost like, for me, so uncomfortable, because I know that that's just what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, there's different things around that, and as you probably know, some of that might be the stage of team formation they're in. Maybe they've not gone past forming into any storming yet, and it might be that it's actually a stage of maturity, because when we have groups at conforming stages, we often do the nice thing, even, and we get stuck. It's interesting. It's almost as if we get stuck in forming for longer periods of time when we are a conforming group, and often what happens then is, if there are people that are trying to get the conversation to a different place, either they get rejected by the group, or sometimes they get to move the group along, or sometimes they leave the group because they get frustrated after a while. Yeah. Nicola.
I'm just thinking of a team I'm starting working with, and the amount of blame, and thinking that's on a scale of blame versus taking responsibility for where the problems are lying. And arrogance and curiosity also seems to fit on the spectrum. That kind of closedness, or really being open. And then I think it links to what Miriam was just saying, is around straightforwardness or honesty on a spectrum, with superficial niceness, but actually bitching about people behind their back.
Yeah.
Because actually the unhappiness is there, but we just can't own it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about that from a maturity perspective, that idea of, am I able to own my own shadow? Can I see myself as good and bad? Now, if enough individuals in the group can do that, or if the story in the group is, in the gestalt of the group is, we are both good and bad, then we can hold the things that aren't working inside the collective. But if we can't even see our own shadow as individuals, because now we're in a collective, which is more complex to manage, and it's harder to do, you have even less of that. Of course, then the badness needs to be elsewhere. Now, an interesting thing to look at is the badness and does the blame get put on other members of this team, or does the blame get put on other people outside the system or authorities? So are we containing some of the blame in the group, which is actually, interestingly, often slightly more mature than just putting all the blame out in some kind of way.
I remember, Lucille, that's also one part that also is defining a maturity level, where you have teams that always look outside and don't take any accountability, responsibility whatsoever, and avoid any conflict within their own team. We have such a nice island here. We are all fine, but all the rest is shite.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that is where there is an incredibly useful place to bring frameworks such as, for example, Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of teams into groups that are struggling with that kind of thing, because it's both structured enough for us to get into the conversation, to not feel too lost in it, but it brings home the idea that there is something like a healthy relationship with conflict, and that accountability and ownership is part of, what we need to have in here. So yeah, some early thoughts around that. So I would love to move us into a place where we have another quick breakout. And here, I think I'll just once again pop people into random groups. And you're going to work with only, no, sorry, people, my brain is really not what it should be. Before we do that, I haven't finished talking about requisite level of maturity. Let's talk about that. And then we will go into our breakout groups. So the idea of requisite level of maturity has to do with when you look at some of the goals or strategies or approaches that a team are wanting to organize around, or that's really a core part of their mandate and how they want to do things. And without looking at the team, you kind of look at that way of doing things and you ask yourself, what level of maturity is our, not just our minimum viable requirement, but our kind of, it starts working at this level of maturity. Now, I'm not even thinking about the team. Let's use some examples there. If I am in a manufacturing plant that wants to implement, Kaizen methodologies, I need to, before I look at everything that has to do with how this plant operates, I need to understand what kinds of behaviors and approaches are required to make that methodology work. And then I can put that alongside where the team or group or organization is operating at this point in time and see what the gap is, if there is one. Now, one of the core methodologies that, everyone from government all the way through to the teams where it actually originated in IT is trying to do is to be more agile. Yeah? So if you, and now those of you that work with agile will immediately be thinking, what kind of agile are we talking about? Probably. If you go to the principles of agile, which is people over process, and there's a whole lot of principles and not actually a hell of a lot of structure beyond the principles, is actually quite an internalizing post-conventional methodology that has to do with self-management, that has to do with ways of organizing. Then we start looking at, are we doing something like SAFe, which is called scaled agile, where I'm trying to actually make agile a little bit more understandable at a conventional level. And I'm giving you lots of processes and, there's a big cadence and we design around that. And, actually before we know it, we're not self-managing so much at all. But there's ways in which we can look at this idea of agile even. You can't just assume agile is agile, but you need to understand, so what is this team trying to do? And therefore, what is the requisite or required level of maturity to make this work optimally? If our, core strategy is to, all the examples that are coming up are not so positive necessarily. So I was working with a bank many years ago, and the exco, and this was under the leadership of the CEO, was really interested in sweating the assets. That was the core strategy. That included people, that included the financial assets, that include pretty much everything. Sweat the assets. So there, I'm not necessarily, if that's what I'm pursuing, sweating the assets, I don't necessarily need a post-conventional level of maturity, although a strategist might sweat assets in really interesting ideas. But that comes from pretty much a specializing place. Get the most out of the people. Don't get them to make too much noise. Optimize your value chain. Do this, do that. You're really trying to optimize things. And because humans were part of the sweating the assets, it's more specializing than performing. So that's the requisite level of maturity for that strategy versus, let's say, another bank that is trying to transform corporate investment banking to be supportive of sustainable, inclusive future, both internally and externally. And therefore, looking at things like ethical governance, setting up specific ways of supporting things that have to do with climate change. Can you see how the requisite level of maturity for the team driving that strategy is quite different? Okay, yay. So once you know what the requisite level of maturity is, You look at what the current level of maturity is, and then you need to, if your job, your mandate is to help the team to meet their strategy, the question is, what's the developmental process that runs alongside the strategy implementation process that helps us get to who we need to be to actually make this strategy work? Sometimes you work with teams at conforming that are trying to do things that are at performing. So you have 2 stages you need to work through. That's not going to happen in a 6-month period. But that means that there's quite a big need to push the team to mature. Otherwise, they're going to waste all the resources that go into implementing the strategy. Yeah, maybe they're already where they're at. But the key thing is to think about this requisite level of maturity.
It makes me, sorry, Rikus. It makes me think that if there's 2 levels, the difference between the requisite and then there's quite a bit of other work to bring realism to whoever is making the strategy.
Yes. Yes.
So
That's
the problem is not
point.
just in that one group. The challenge is it's just.
Yeah. I'll put a picture up and then Rikus, over to you. So this is my my picture I love to use around this. You know, this is Dubai a couple of decades ago. You know, so if we and now, so if we're building a strategy that assumes we're this organization, when actually we're this organization, we need to be a little bit more realistic, because, you know, your strategy to have, you know, have all these amazing things happening as if this is the world is very unrealistic. Yeah. Rikus.
Lucille, I'm wondering if one has some sort of technical process, some strategy you want to implement, and then next to it there's this developmental process. Can the technical process be a useful a mechanism? Can a developmental process be easier because of this, or are they just both making each other more complicated?
No, I think this is where like really exquisite organization development work happens, in the interweaving of those 2 processes together, where the development work is the technical work because of the way in which we're implementing it, and vice versa. That's when I really get to exquisite integration. So as an example, I'm not running this is how you implement SAFe, and then I'm sending all my product owners on a leadership training course, and very far away from this thing that we're implementing, we're, you know, teaching you how to be more emotionally intelligent and blah, 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 whatever it is that we're doing here. It's about bringing those processes together so that as we working with the technical implementation, we're using the cadence of the technical implementation and the conversations that are already there to do the developmental work. And when we're in the developmental space, we have ways of engaging with the technical work without getting lost inside it, that allows us to do the maturation process. It's quite tricky, but when you get that right, that's like a symphony orchestra being conducted by someone really powerful making magic. When I grow up, I want to be able to do that more often. It's my personal aspiration. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else that wanted to say something here? Duncan, and then Nicola.
I had a question about how to engage the team in building consensus about where they want to go developmentally. So obviously, as the facilitator or the consultant, we can come in and say, well, here's where you are. Here's where we think, I think you should go. And you could do that with just the stakeholder, but I'm assuming that you really want to get the team bought into where they're going. So I'm curious what people's experiences has been with how transparent they are with, like, as an example, introducing a model like this and having a discussion about it, as opposed to maybe a less explicit way would be to create a set of team guiding principles and facilitate knowing in our head where we think they need to go and guide them with a less explicit sharing of this as a model.
Yeah. Good thoughts. And maybe some people want to fill into Duncan's question there as well. My first reaction would be, we need to be very cautious as external people to assume that we know or have a right to know where a team should be going. Yeah, I think there's, it's just that thing of how much responsibility are we taking? And what is the mandate I'm being brought into? So for me, there's always the mandate piece. That's the starting point. So I just put that out there. In terms of different ways of working with it, absolutely. I think there's explicit and more implicit ways of getting the group involved in the developmental agenda. For me, when I'm working inside an explicit change process, for example, the implementation of a new way of doing things or embedding a new culture, the reason why we're going on the journey, the developmental journey we're going on, is implicit in that project that we're doing. That whole conversation around what makes this work, what makes this fail, and how can we be part of what makes this work. So then the project is the business case. So that's the one piece. It's really lovely, then if I'm not necessarily working in a space where it's as explicit as that, things like a team alliance or a team, getting the team to agree to the kind of culture we want to build, and therefore who do we need to be, that's another way forward. I think if we zoom out even further, the broader agenda in the world is always there for us as well, to say, if we're in an age where the environment is collapsing, where social structures are collapsing, where the ways in which the economy has been organized for a long time is not working as much anymore, and our problems are becoming more and more complex, who do we need to be to navigate all of this, which is the even outside of the organization mandate that can get people into what the development agenda is in some way. I love working with government because it's so easy to make the developmental agenda get buy-in into this. Okay, so you government, you're trying to solve for massive inequality and poverty. If you're governing in South Africa, as an example, massive. So how complex is it to solve poverty? As soon as we understand that there's not one lever we can pull, or even 5 levers in sequence, and that we're grappling with that level of complexity, then it's like, okay, so you want to run government here, you need to get into that level of complexity, and you need to become that comfortable with anxiety and uncertainty and all the things that goes with the maturity piece. Yeah. Anyone else that wants to offer some thoughts to what Duncan shared? Nicola, you were next in the queue.
Yeah, just when you were talking about, 2 things made me think of someone Kate and I have the privilege of working with, who 2 owners of a company who are both, I think, at strategizing, and the MD who we think is at performing. And it's just so fascinating speaking to them, because it's almost like the different elements of the same coin, it actually doesn't matter which comes first. So they're busy as a kind of key differentiator implementing this quick response times ticketing thing as part of a technical solution, but are totally seeing it in terms of what are individuals going to have to grapple with in themselves, with the changed process and collectively. And there's an emphasis on making progress, both around the technical and the cultural, that there's just this implicit belief that you put energy into both and they'll spin off on each other. Doesn't matter which side of the coin you focus on, they're both going to flip the same coin. So cool.
Yeah, that is a privilege to work in a system where you're able to see that both benefit the end goal equally, and one's not leading and the other one's an afterthought.
Yeah.
Which is maybe back to that thing that Rick has pulled in. You know, when you can bring the developmental and the technical into being one thing, absolutely, there's a magic that emerges.
Yeah. And the thing you said about sweat the asset, that's kind of comes back in after the internalizing thing of work hard, work this asset, but it's in such a sustainable and respectful and broad seeing way of how do we inject capacity into the system.
Yeah.
It's not linear mechanical.
Yeah, absolutely. Many ways of thinking about those words as well, clearly. Okay. So what I want us to do a short breakout on here, having thought about these things, is, and those of you that have been in many of my sessions, you know that I come back to this slide of how do we mature a lot. So I'll do it again. If we want to, and this is true for individuals as well as for teams, if we want teams to mature, we need heat. We need to bring different perspectives into the conversation, and then we need to create balcony moments. And if we have that mix in a safe and contained enough way that we're not losing our teams, like Pat and I becoming as belligerent with things that are too far ahead as things that are dragging us down. If we're able to do this in the way that meets the team where they're at and then extends and meets and extends and meets and extends, we get the process of team maturation. So what I want us to think about now, and we'll just do, maybe we can, I'm actually going to take group one out. We'll just do 2 breakouts. One group will talk about if we were to use this framework to help a team that's in specializing access a performing action logic, what are 2 or 3 things we would do? So this is now designing developmental inputs to help a team bridge from specializing into performing. And then the second group will go into performing, into internalizing action logic. Yeah. And you'll just bring back 2 or 3 ideas of what you might do. I will set up a choice for people to choose what room you want to go to. Let's just rename specializing into performing. So you choose which conversation you want to go into. And we will spend 15 minutes in the breakout and bring your top 3 ideas back. You should be able to, most of you should be able to choose which room you want to join. If you can't see the options, if you're on the online version of Zoom, just tell me where I should assign you and you can go there. Just unmute yourself if you want me to assign you. Welcome back. Yay. So I'd love to hear. Let's hear from the two teams. Just top couple of ideas. What can we do to take a group, a team from specializing to performing? Whoever was in that conversation that wants to share some exciting ideas. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we only really uncovered 2 ideas in ours. Yeah, sort of didn't have enough time to explore more, but I'm happy to share the one that everybody seemed to be quite excited about. And then Miriam, maybe you want to share yours too. So mine is, I've just designed it for a team that I suspect is in specializing, but haven't done the assessments yet. But I know that there's some people in performing. It's an IT team, very technical, and the whole thing that they want is to now develop their EQ. They've recognized that their IQ is great, but they want to develop their EQ. So I'm giving a taster, a little bit of a launch of the program next week. Yeah. And it's a set the scene, and then a 20-minute sound journey with their own headphones on, like the Secret Sunrise headphones, of the most amazing music, diverse, evocative, rousing, punchy music, and then leading from that into people debriefing in pairs as to what came up and how it was for them and what they got from that, and then into making sense of it as a group, and then into sharing some of the science behind, well, what does EQ bring us from some of the research around the world.
Very nice. I like how you've inverted the sequence from where, what's the benefits of EQ into an experience of sorts. The risk in that, which is, I think it's a risk that we always, when we're doing developmental work, we always have a risk. If there's no risk, it's not stretching the team. It's not a heat experience. And that risk is for us and for others. But you have the risk that some people are going to think this woman is off with the fairies and this is very weird. Yeah. And it's a good gamble. I think that's great. So I love it. Thank you so much, Kate.
Yeah, pleasure.
Yeah. And then let's hear Miriam, your idea.
I don't remember exactly what I said. How's that? How about those that heard me? Tell me.
I remember.
Andrea.
So you said that you open the team with, what does it feel like to be part of this team?
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
And then how do you want to feel? How would you like to feel?
Okay. Now I could add to that because I observe them, how they're speaking, their emotions, who they're looking at, that whole contact, but also are they here or here? And most people talk about here. And so we move from that and I point that and I would pay attention, talk about all of that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Miriam. One of the nice ways to push specializing teams into a performing frame is to work with metaphor and to get the teams to work with metaphors as well. So to kind of build on that idea that Miriam shared, is what metaphor describes what it feels like to be part of this team. Does it feel like a pineapple? Does it feel like a roller coaster ride, a train that's about to derail, like swimming in a bowl of marshmallows? I don't know. But the moment you give them a task where the only way in which you can answer the task is to get out of just linear thinking, then and there's many ways in which one can do lots of ways of thinking about, this is the output that we want. What's the way in which we can go about this that forces people into more conceptual or more abstract or more emotional? Your question was, what does it feel like to be in the team? Now that's great. And then, people don't get into the feelings easily. Another angle in would be to get them into abstraction. So brilliant. Love it. Yeah. Anyone else that would like to add anything for that specializing to performing design thinking?
Lucille,
Yes, Alistair.
what are your thoughts around meeting them where they're at in terms of wanting that structured way to get to the emotions, giving them like some sort of worksheet to work through? And then when they get there, you ask them questions like, how did it feel to go through this process?
Great. That's another way. So give people a technical task, get them to operate at the action logic of the team, and then elevate the sense making by getting them to reflect back on it. So that's a lovely kind of structure. It's a structure that's used in some kind of way quite often in the agile arc of process as well. So you go through the sprint, you have your retrospective. The retrospective is not just about ideally what we could have done differently from a content perspective, but how we could have worked differently and how we felt about the sprint or whatever it is. So that's a nice, that's one that gives a little bit of heat. So let's think about this. So I meet them where they're at, and then I give them a second part of the task that elevates their sense making. So there's a bit of heat in there. We don't always talk about it. We just get on to the next topic on the agenda. Versus on the other side of the spectrum, Kate's exercise is a lot of heat. Yeah. And all of them in between is useful. Yeah.
And just one thing that just came up for me now regarding Kate's situation is to say, sort of making them aware of the business case of being emotionally intelligent. And I think in IT, there's a lot of talk around empathy. To design an app, for example, I need to love it. So even if you've got this massive brain with this code, if I can't relate to your app emotionally, you're not going to get that engagement. So weaving that carrot at the end of this process could work, but then won't that make them stick into that mission of specializing? So there's that risk.
Yeah, there's always a risk. There's always a risk, but I love that. And that's that thing of like drinking your own champagne. That's always really useful. If we say we need to build things that people have an emotional connection with out there, what is the emotional connection in here? You know, it's that thing of like, we can't do out there what we can't do for ourselves. Is a nice principle that works with all of this. Okay. So the comment I'll make as we transition into performing into internalizing is keep in mind that you do not mature a team through one experience. So if you think about what it means for a team to have matured, it means that when they self-regulate, they start doing things differently. And sometimes that's why we as facilitators keep working in a system, is because there's an inability to self-regulate at the level that we need to self-regulate at. So we keep bringing people back in. So that's really great for those of us that do that kind of work. But the core thing, if we think about maturing a team over time, is what's the long-term journey that gets them to self-regulate in this way, is the curious question that we ask over time. And we have multiple of these experiences in some way along the way. It's a journey. An event gets me to, in the moment, jump into a higher action logic, more mature action logic, but then I go back to my center of gravity. Yeah, cool. Let's hear from the group that we're working with performing to internalizing. So that's not only a jump in action logic, but out of the conventional and into the post-conventional world. Any ideas on how we support that? Duncan.
So we batted around two ideas, and Nicola will share one of them. One of them was getting people outside of their typical way of thinking by taking them out into nature. And given that they're going from performing to internalizing, that there would be a little bit more setup and intention and thought going in, almost to prep the learning, to like grease the wheels before they even go in, so that you could further the learning and the intention coming out. And the idea would be to create an experience that has them experience some discomfort and likely includes failure as a way for them to really start to understand, to shift from a technical focus to a little bit more of a relational focus. And then being able to have some kind of debrief on the back end that helps them start to be able to articulate how do they want to be, how do they want to work as an entity, as a team. And then I think the point about paying it forward, I think there's something that would need to come out of that about like, so where do they go from here? How do they become self-regulating in a way that they can give each other feedback with those newfound intentions?
Wow, so one thing I love and one thing I notice. The thing that I love is this idea of building in something where failure is inevitable. I think that's an amazing design idea. I'm noting it down for my design catalog. The thing that I noticed, I don't know if anyone else noticed that, is when we were talking about the specializing into performing activities, they seemed a bit more condensed. And this is a little bit more of a meaty process in some kind of way. And that's something to just notice. The earlier stage maturity things that we want to do, heat experiences often need quicker containment. If I'm going from conforming to specializing or specializing to performing, I need quicker containment. Whereas when I'm starting to go from performing into internalizing, which is the place of a lot of self-management, I can give people longer, more complex periods, and I can be sometimes a bit more hands-off as a facilitator. I remember when Harrison Owen came to South Africa in the 90s, early 90s, and he was facilitating training in how to do open space facilitation, which is a post-conventional methodology. And I remember my dad had organized the whole thing. And so he came back after the first day and he's like, we just paid a lot of money to have a facilitator sit under a tree for most of the day. And he's like, and it's totally worth it. It's totally worth it, he said. But, that I remember that interesting thing of how hands-on we are as facilitators, how much we feel we need to intervene. If I'm working with a group that's going from conforming to specializing, just as an idea, and we're working on giving each other basic feedback or using thinking environment or whatever it is, you can't just walk out of the room and think that the group will follow the advice or the rule to not give each other advice. You have to supervise quite a lot. But if you're working with a team that's already in post-conventional, you can go sit under the tree and the team can self-regulate. And if you do that for a very early stage team, the amount of heat that's created can feel uncontained, and then the wildfire burns and it burns you as the facilitator. So it's such a fine balance. Any other ideas around that performing to internalizing shift? Nicola.
So we were saying there's such it's such a leap of faith for a team to jump out of performing, and what would motivate it. And in our conversation, because we say it was loss and failure and death, actually, often the things that contextualize why on earth would you not be putting your outcomes as your primary focus. So on the back of that, it was an idea of going to an old age home, taking the team to an old age home and dressing them in old age outfits and sitting in a room looking at death, and then coming together at the dinner table and eating the food of the institution and talking about why their work was successful. which probably wouldn't be about results in Q2. It would be about meaning and the deeper connection to the work that they did, just as an entry point into that logic.
Beautiful. And I think that that gives us a great idea around how to work with both the concept of, what is the shift about, as well as working with how do I get people into a space, into an environment where there's heat and a different perspective that comes in because of that. So I really like that. There's colliding perspectives, there's heat, and then there's the invitation to elevated sense making all wrapped into that too. So lovely, great design thinking. So one of the things that we will share, and I'll ask Ilse to send it out for us after tomorrow, is just very briefly, there are some ideas for design. What are neglected areas? How do we design some thinking into there for maturing the team? So I'll share these together with the other slides with everyone that was here tomorrow. So that's the one thought. And then that's about as coherent as I could be today. So an invitation for just a quick round of 1, 2, 3 words in checkout that anyone wants to bring. Oh, the thought that I lost, which I had before when Nicola was speaking, is that's why Theory U is such a powerful transformation process. The Theory U process of Otto Scharmer is a developmental arc, a whole journey. And it starts with sense-making journey or sensing journeys, which takes me into a context that enables me to start thinking about my issues in new ways. And so often thinking about, given the shift that we're trying to make, what kind of sense-making journey is really helpful and useful here. So when you're trying to do specializing to performing in a university context for a women's leadership program, agency, like not feeling that I have zero agency in this very rigorous academic environment is one of the themes in the same way. So where do you help people think about agency? Take them to a women's prison. There we go. Thinking about the environment that enables almost you can be contrarian. It's like coyote energy that forces like old age home to help me think about meaning is a useful arc. So we're out of time. So let's do a couple of people that want to pop, just 2 or 3 people that want to pop what was useful for you today in 2 or 3 words. And then in 2 minutes, we will close the room to honor time. Miriam has to go. Yay. See you, Miriam. Lovely to have you here. Anyone else that wants to pop? Yeah.
Just excited about, what's possible, and just really useful to have the steer around like what's needed and ideas that meet that, and just excited about the experiences. And I really was also very useful, Lucille, was the strategy connection with maturity, like what maturity is needed to deliver on that strategy. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks. Let's do 2 more comments. Anyone else that wants to say anything? Just unmute and pop.
It was great for me to hear the perspectives. And to also hear Miriam Duncan, when you were speaking about how you observe what you observe in teams to add to what Lucille also shared there. That was really very interesting for me. But all in all the perspectives here, very interesting. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, Lucille, for holding.
Pleasure. Last comment, and then we close off.
I'll just say I really enjoy the idea of putting the learning and the construct in a developmental way of thinking into design. At one point, I just laughed out loud with my group and I said, "This is fun. It's just like, especially when you're not having to solve it for an actual deliverable where there's stakes involved. So thank you. This was really wonderful.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks so much, everyone. And as Duncan says that, I have this image of Julia taking an entire team at performing to the beach for a day as part of a workshop and having them walk around the beach. You know, who knows? There's lots of fun in the work that we do, and there's method to the madness. Remember that. It's not just mad, there's method to the madness. Have a beautiful day. Have a beautiful evening wherever in the world you are. And for those of you that haven't done level 2 yet on maturity, our next set of dates, April 6, 8, 11, and 13. And for the Africa-Europe time zone, it's kind of early evening. For the US time zone, it's kind of early morning Pacific time, mid-morning Eastern. Great. See you all in 2 weeks' time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.